one of the most critical elements then is the magnesium side of things. So ideally if we're looking at a pre-calver type product, that it has about 25% magnesium. So typically a cow needs about 40 grams of magnesium per day. So you'd be saying 100 to 120 grams of that pre-calver mineral is roughly 25 to 30 grams, and you'll be getting 10 to 15 from your silage, depending on the magnesium content of the silage as well.
I'm joined this week by Aisling Claffey, Teagasc ruminant nutritionist. Aisling joins us to discuss what's important to remember when it comes to the upcoming dry cow period. Maybe to start, what's important for farmers from a nutritional point of view when planning the dry cow period? I suppose people will be starting to dry cows off now over the next couple of weeks. What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, well, I suppose kind of two main factors. We'll be looking at the length of the dry cow period and silage quality and how the two kind of feed together. So in an ideal scenario, what we should have is good quality, palatable dry cow silage. Generally, typically sitting around the 68 DMD mark is kind of the sweet spot for that dry cow period. That will get good intakes, and typically 8 to 10 weeks then for your mature cows on that type of silage will be more than adequate. And if there's any thin cows in the herd and your first lactation animals, generally 10 to 12 weeks on that type of silage, it will be ideal to have them in and around that 3.25 then for calving. So that's what we're really looking at in terms of the overall silage quality, is around that 68 DMD mark. But ideally, like that, it wants to have good intake characteristics, so well preserved, good lactic acid preservation, ideally somewhere between 25-30% dry matter. We're going to get good intakes, and that those animals have plenty of opportunity to put on condition then, and be in that sweet spot then, like calving down around that 3.25 mark.
Really? So what you're saying is it's adequate time to ensure that we get cows calving down in that kind of 3.25 of a body condition score mark. And you're looking for mammary repair, I suppose, as well over that period.
Yeah, so there's, I suppose, a couple of aspects to that dry cow period length is allowing tissue repair in the mammary gland, particularly cows that maybe have touch of infection in the quarters, so your selective dry cow therapy will come in there. Enough opportunity to put on condition, particularly if there's individuals, and look, herd condition in general has been quite good this year, but there will be individual animals in every herd, and given first calvers plenty of opportunity to put on condition as well, to give them a chance to catch back up. And like colostrum production takes 4 to 6 weeks as well, so we don't want to interfere with that process as well. So we need to give that animal plenty of time to repair tissue, get into good condition. And like in the last month in particular, energy requirements increased from over maintenance by about 50%. So that last month, or the last 6 to 8 weeks, there's a lot of energy being diverted into the calf. There's rapid fetal growth, so there's two things going on there in terms of getting condition back on track if it's a little bit behind target, and that rapid fetal growth. So it's not like everything is just going into condition during those last 2 months. There's rapid fetal growth going on as well. So there's a lot of things going on in the background that maybe aren't that visible to the person watching those animals.
And I suppose milk price is good, Aisling. So what you're really saying is don't be chasing extra days. It's going to cost you in the long run. The tendency might be where milk price is good and herds have milked well is to continue on for longer than they should.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But there's a balance to be struck from that point of view. I suppose not having that condition next spring is going to put animals under pressure, particularly if you got into a spell of very wet weather, if you haven't very good quality silage on farm. And cows need that condition to be able to mobilise and produce milk in early lactation. They're genetically driven to produce milk. So if we haven't got that condition in place, they're going to end up losing excess condition and being under target then as we approach breeding season. So it's really important that we have them in that sweet spot around that 3.25 mark, that we have a little bit of scope to for body condition score mobilisation in early lactation without compromising fertility subsequently.
You mentioned there about getting silage tested, and I suppose when people go testing silage, often they're thinking about the best quality silage, let it be for maybe feeding cows in the early lactation period or even for young stock. Is the dry cow silage element often forgot about in terms of silage testing?
Yeah, so often what you'd see is that we'll go and test the first cut, and we're happy enough once that comes back reasonably good, and we're not kind of maybe worried about anything else that's going on the farm. But I suppose every summer is different, and depending on when that second and third cut was maybe made on some farms, and when grass is headed out and stuff, there can be huge variation in quality. Like what we're seeing coming back from the labs in general on an average year is 68 DMD is the average run of the silage that's been produced on farm. Um, and there's a lot of silage falling below that. So that can cause a lot of condition on cows and mightn't be that visible when cows are dried off. But as they start to come under pressure in that last month before they calve, they could start mobilising a significant amount of condition. So it's really important that we know that we actually have that 68 DMD silage in the yard, that we're actually meeting those requirements in terms of animals' needs for energy in those last 6 to 8 weeks. Because in a lot of cases, we could see silage quality down at 62 or 63 DMD, and we need to supplement. But also we could have cows putting on a little bit of excess condition during that period if our silage quality is sitting around 71, 72 DMD. Or we mightn't actually be prioritising our best quality silage for early lactation. We mightn't realise that maybe our third cut silage is actually the best quality silage in the yard, and that's what we need to keep for early lactation cows and maybe young stock as well. So it's important to see where everything is at.
Test all the silage, really, is what you're saying.
Ideally, and I know that's challenging maybe if there's a lot of bales, but definitely from the pit silage point of view, have a good handle on what's in the pit side anyway. It can be hard if there's a lot of bales on farm. I suppose this has been a great grass growing season, so there probably will be a lot more bales around in general. But I suppose when you're making those bales, it's maybe being cute about how you line them up. If it's good quality surplus, then you maybe keep them in one stack, and if it's a paddock that you have surplus grass, but you're using the opportunity to clean out a paddock that's gone dirty on you, that they're maybe putting another stack, and you treat the two maybe differently then in terms of using them to supplement either in the back end of the year or in early lactation as well.
I get you. And how important, I suppose that's a nutritional test we're after speaking about. How important, or is it important? You hear a little bit more about it, but still not a lot of farmers doing it in terms of maybe a mineral analysis on that dry cow silage.
Yeah, so I suppose what we've seen from the recent transition cow study is that close to half of silages are very high in K, and that's just been done on a very small cohort of samples and farms. So, and I've seen some extreme results in cases. So I think it's really worth doing, particularly if you've had issues in the past few years in terms of subclinical and clinical milk fever. If you're not getting a good handle on that on farm in particular, it is definitely well worth spending the money on the silage test. And really what you're looking at there, James, is the silage that you're going to be feeding to those cows in the last 2 to 3 weeks. So if you have enough second cut silage that's going to see out most of the dry cow period, that's the silage you're probably targeting. And you're trying to particularly identify very high K silage and very high decab silage. And I suppose there's 2 components to that. That high K silage interferes with magnesium absorption, and that's a really critical element for the whole calcium mobilisation piece at the start of lactation. And that high decab feeds into that as well in terms of the efficacy of the parathyroid hormone that's involved in mobilising that calcium as well. So really, really critical thing. I suppose we often see farmers get hung up on trace elements and different aspects this time of year. But for me, magnesium intake and having a suitable silage in front of those cows that's going to minimise issues with magnesium absorption and really help drive calcium mobilisation during that transition into early lactation is really critical. And I think it's probably something that is overlooked on farm, particularly subclinical milk fever, where it's not as obvious maybe that all of these problems are actually linked to calcium mobilisation rather than maybe trace mineral nutrition.
And what are you talking about cost-wise for a silage mineral analysis?
Typically about €100 for the sample, in and around.
What's a case of milk fever costing the average dairy farmer, or is there a figure on it?
Probably close to €500 a cow. And I suppose the challenge with milk fever is that if you have a couple of cows that's going down, there is probably a significant proportion of animals that are in subclinical milk fever state as well in the background. And often things maybe are overlooked. You know, we might have a couple of stillborn calves. Is that because calcium mobilisation has been impaired and cows are slow to open up and get that calf out, that uterine contractions are being impaired, because calcium is really important for muscle function. Um, that could have impacts on overall rumen function as well. Like there are little things in the background that aren't really that visible on farm, but are just reducing the overall health and of those cows and setting them up for a good start to lactation. So a lot of those costs creep in, and look, we know about 60 to 70% of health issues are linked with that early lactation and transition cow period. So it's very small money in the scheme of things.
Yeah, we'd be encouraging people to get that mineral analysis done, as you say, given its importance there.
Yeah,
What,
particularly if they're having issues consistently year to year.
yeah, exactly. To stay on the silage piece for a bit, just on that, when you do get your test results, and you mentioned some of the things, but we'll say there's different classes of stock in the farm, and we're focusing maybe on the dry cows here. But like typically, what are you looking for when you get those test results back? We'll say.
Yeah, so look, as a general run, you're looking at the nutritional characteristics of it. So that's your DMD, or the digestibility of that feed. You're looking at the crude protein. So particularly for younger stock, you want a really high quality silage with good levels of protein. So ideally it'll be up on your milk and cow quality silage, or 74 DMD, 14, 15% crude protein ideally for those younger animals. You also need to be looking at the preservation characteristics as well. So whereas the dry matter ash is a very wet silage, is that going to limit intake? Is the pH appropriate? So the wetter your silage is, the lower you want your pH. And that'll all help in terms of the stability of that pit silage in the yard as well. Particularly where we've gotten into bigger and bigger pits of silage, the pit face could be left exposed there for up to a week in some yards. So preservation is important there too, because if it's poorly preserved and there's a lot of aerobic instability, we'll have losses there at the pit face in terms of the heating of that silage, losing energy. The intake's not going to be as good on it. So those are things that shouldn't be overlooked. So the lactic acid content of the silage as well is really important. Anything that's going to contribute to the intake, because we could have really good quality silage in the yard, but if it's poorly preserved and has poor intake characteristics, those animals are not going to have the same opportunity to express themselves as really high quality silage with really high intake potential. Like that could be the difference in 2 or 3 kilos of intake on a dry matter basis, which is a huge energy intake gap if you have poor intake on the silage as well. Particularly for younger growing stock, they really need high quality silage. But intake characteristics are important, as well as the nutritional characteristics when looking at those results.
So really, what you're saying to me is there should be two different qualities of silage being fed out over that late autumn, spring period.
Yeah, ideally, like if you're looking at maybe most of your stock, your young stock coming in mid to late November, they should be going on to high quality silage. And what tends to happen in a lot of yards is that we maybe just open the second cut silage and feed it to everything. And if that's 68 DMD silage and it's perfect for dry cows, that's fine for that cohort. But if you have maybe 30 heifers in the yard, and maybe some of those within that group behind target, they need to be on really high quality plain nutrition. We need them achieving a minimum of 0.6 average daily gain a day over that period, particularly the ones that are behind target at that stage as well. They need to be pushed on in particular.
And managing condition in these dry cows, you said it, there's a fair bit of feed has went into herds, maybe for, periods of the year where grass growth dropped off, or maybe there wasn't as much rain as people wanted or needed. Cows in general are in good condition. Is there an issue there in terms of how do you manage that? Big quick bit of advice on that, because as you said, there's always a range within herd. How you're managing that, and it'll depend really on the silage quality you're feeding, I suppose, Ashton, will it?
Yeah, well, look, ideally, your 68 DMD silage is not going to overdo cows in general, but that depends on how long they're dried for. So, the particular cohort you'll be watching there be your later calvers in general, but that's why it's important to know what you're working with, because if it is slightly better quality silage, you might be maybe looking at restricting it to an extent, or maybe saying that that's exactly what they need, and we'll feed a little bit of hay or straw alongside it, to keep them filled, but to avoid excessively high energy intake in those couple of weeks. But for the most part, if you have 68 DMD silage, and 8 weeks dry, you should be fairly sound for those cows that are sitting around that 3 mark at drying off. If you have individual cows that are a bit over conditioned, ideally you'd be able to batch them off, which isn't always that practical to do on farm, or those later calving cows that are going to be maybe dry for 12 to 14, maybe even 16 weeks if they're into April calving cows and been dried off there in mid-December. They could probably be going on to lower quality silage or just maybe a more restricted allowance of that silage to try just maintain condition in the short term, because like that cow that's dried off in mid-December that's not calving till late March, April, she very much only needs her maintenance requirements met. Whereas the cow that's calving on the 1st of February, she's in a period of rapid fetal growth. She's in month 8 and month 9 of gestation. So they're doing two very different jobs during that same period.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So to come back to the K piece, we're okay. So what is high K in a silage test, and what do you do if you have? You mentioned the last 2 or 3 weeks, like the dry cow period is probably 8 weeks plus for your mature cows, and 11, 12 weeks for your first calvers. So why did you mention that 2 to 3 weeks and the importance of that?
High K silage, what we're really looking at is Anton, maybe ideally it should be under 1.8, but realistically our silages tend to be higher in K in general. So ideally we'd like it below 2.4. The idea behind that then is that it's impacting on magnesium absorption in particular and our calcium mobilization. But that's why we're really focused on the last couple of weeks. Like some people will panic and say, Jesus, sure, that's my pit of dry cow feed and it's high in K, what am I going to do? But for the most part, most of those cows are just having time off, trying to build condition, meet the energy requirements of that calf that's growing inside them. It's only in that last maybe fortnight that we're really looking at cows starting to spring up, and the focus maybe switching towards that transition into early lactation. They're mobilising a bit more condition during that period. They're starting to switch on towards lactation. So at that point of calving, there's a rapid increase for calcium requirements, and we need the cow to be set up to mobilise calcium during that critical period. So that's really why we're only looking at the last 2 weeks. And I suppose it's impossible to get every animal down to maybe picking out the final few days for that animal. So by saying 2 weeks, you're kind of generally able to group a cohort that are within maybe 10 to 20 days of calving and making sure that they're prioritised during that period, because they're the ones that are starting to come to that point of mobilising calcium and need to be able to get consistent magnesium intake, ideally low K intake during that period, and be well primed
So
to mobilise calcium.
it's not the end of the world then if your silage does test a little bit higher for K. Once you know that, really, is what you're saying, Aisling. I suppose you need a percentage of your silage, or you need something there to obviously go in and dilute that in that last 2 to 3 week period. But it's just the importance of actually knowing that and managing that. Is that what you're saying to me?
Exactly, yeah. It's identifying it on time. And in some cases, like it might be slightly high K, but something very simple like feeding additional magnesium chloride to that close-up group might be sufficient enough to counteract that K. So you're just getting a little bit extra magnesium in, but it's counteracting that high cab. So and the mag chloride flakes are, I suppose, a real negative decab product, and they're counteracting that high decab silage that's associated typically with high K in general as well. So something like that can be really effective. But I suppose it's identifying the silage and how high it is in general. Like, so if it's only maybe at 2.6 and we can dilute it with mag chloride, brilliant. But every so often you will get an extreme result that's maybe up in 3%, maybe even 4% K. And in that case, for your very close-up cows, we might have to look at an alternative silage altogether for that close-up group. So that might be maybe finding something else in the yard that maybe didn't get as much K, or it might be finding a batch of bales that got no slurry as well that might be low in K. So it's just maybe identifying an alternative source if you have a very extreme result. But for the most part, a lot of them can be tackled with something very simple and effective like magnesium chloride.
What sort of rate would you be looking at feeding that then to in that close-up period?
Depending on the silage, probably 50 grams, maybe up to 100 grams in some cases. And that can be done either through the water. So you could be putting it into the water in the calving shed or that close-up group of cows, or it can be adjusted on the silage as well. But I suppose the thing to be conscious there is that if we're feeding high rates of it, it's not the most palatable. So it's important to make sure that it's not affecting intake as well.
We're kind of onto the mineral piece, and obviously a very important element. What's required from the dry cow point of view?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the most critical elements then is the magnesium side of things. So ideally we're looking at, if we're looking at a pre-calver type product, that it has about 25% magnesium. So typically a cow needs about 40 grams of magnesium per day. So you'd be saying 100 to 120 grams of that pre-calver mineral is roughly 25 to 30 grams, and you'll be getting 10 to 15 from your silage, depending on the magnesium content of the silage as well. So that's a really effective way of meeting that requirement. But really important that we're looking at that. And I suppose the big thing with magnesium is that she hasn't the capacity to store that. So really important that we're doing that job every day consistently. It's not getting overlooked, because often when we have maybe a run in of problems for a couple of days, it might be just that everything's quite busy. A lot of cows calved in the last 2 days, and maybe the minerals got overlooked and magnesium intake was affected then as a result. So really important job and needs to be done consistently. So ideally assign one person that's going to make sure it's done right and done every day. I suppose in general then we're also looking at vitamin D, because that has really important association with calcium mobilization as well. So ideally 100,000 units of vitamin D is a minimum. So that's really important. And then the phosphorus range as well. Ideally maybe 3 to 5% as the max. I know from just the paper in the recent Moore Park Open Day booklet, there was huge range in phosphorus content in pre-calver minerals, up I think as high as 15%. And excess P during that period is not good for calcium mobilization as well. So generally somewhere between 3 to 5% is more than sufficient from a phosphorus point of view.
Is there anything else specific then that you'd be looking at? We'll say that you'd say that makes that a very, very good mineral versus an average mineral spec, we'll say.
I suppose, look, in general, you're just looking at meeting the minimum requirements for your trace minerals then outside of those key points in terms of magnesium, vitamin D and phosphorus. So ideally you're sitting somewhere around 40 to 50 milligrams of selenium per kilo. Generally most minerals will have around 500 milligrams iodine. Ideally around 3,000 milligrams of copper. Typically we'll see 80 to 100 milligrams of cobalt. And then zinc probably somewhere between 4 to 5,000 units, and then manganese somewhere around 2,000. Look, I suppose they all have important roles in terms of overall health and the immune function of the cow herself. And then there's a lot of elements that are contributing to the calf as well. So iodine is really important in terms of preventing weak calves and stillbirths. Manganese really important for bone development. Copper is really important to prevent weak calves. Vitamin A really important for organ development as well. So they all have an important role to play. And in fairness, most mineral packs are really good at meeting them. I suppose what can vary between different minerals is the level of protected coppers and zincs, and selenium as well. They'd be kind of some of the more distinguishing features. But for me, the big thing is to get the magnesium content right, the vitamin D content right, and the consistency with the product. And sometimes if you have issues in a particular year, well, the pre-calver minerals don't tend to change that much, but what could be changing in the background is what's going on in terms of the mineral profile of that silage. So that's why we could have a particularly bad year for different issues, rather than maybe from a mineral point of view as such. Once we're doing the mineral consistently on a day-to-day basis with those animals, making sure that they're getting enough. So that's where the mineral testing can maybe answer some of those questions in the background as well.
And when it comes to, I suppose, buying your dry cow mineral, you're buying on spec rather than price. Obviously, when you're happy with spec, by all means, price around, Aisling, but it's important to get a well-spec mineral, I suppose, first and foremost, yeah?
Yeah, that's it. Like, make sure it's hitting those minimum criteria, and look, your advisor will be able to give you a little quick handout that kind of ticks, these are the boxes you need to be ticking. And then if there's €200 the difference, but you're meeting those requirements, then that's for you to decide what you get after that. But if there's money to be saved there, once you're meeting the minimum requirements, there's no issue that way. But I suppose it's just sitting down and making sure you're not skimping on the overall spec. But for
Talk
me,
to
still the
me.
big ones would be magnesium and phosphorus content and vitamin D.
Yes, tell me about length of time we should be feeding dry cow minerals, and I suppose the rates. And the rates kind of vary with different minerals as well, don't they?
Yeah, so ideally, look, you're looking at that 6 to 8 week period. And I suppose from that point of view, it's because some of those minerals are really important for the fetal development during that period. So I mentioned like your copper and your iodine and your manganese and vitamin A, that they're all linked with weak calves, organ development, bone development. So there's massive growth going on in that last trimester. So really important from that point of view that you're getting it in for that minimum 6 weeks, ideally closer to the 8 weeks. So ideally from the time you're drying off cows nearly, definitely from early December, you're looking at having your pre-calf mineral introduced for the most part of those earlier calving animals. So I suppose ideally you're looking at the manufacturer's recommendations because they'll give you a good guide. But typically in general you're sitting somewhere between 100 to 120 grams per head per day. And I suppose it depends on how much magnesium and that you want to get in. And I suppose that's where you run the risk with maybe overspec minerals in terms of maybe very high P or things like that, that if you're feeding a higher rate and it's overspec on an element, you can be overdoing some aspect of it that might be actually having negative impacts. On the other hand, so really important that you're following the instructions from that point of view. Generally 100 to 120 grams, and I suppose that's why it's important to have maybe one person that sits down at the start and says, right, there's 60 cows in that shed. If every animal's getting 120 grams, what do I need to be feeding? And am I doing it once a day or twice a day, depending on feed space in particular? Like feed space is very limiting in the yards, which it is in many cases. Maybe ideally we're doing that twice a day and giving a half rate morning and evening to give
Mm.
maybe more animals an opportunity to get access to it as well.
Last question I often hear is boluses, slicks, buckets, all of these things. Sure, it'd be a lot easier just to hang a lick on the wall and cure all our mineral requirements for the dry cow.
Yeah, and I suppose, look, a lot of those products do seem very convenient, but I suppose for me, what your pre-calver mineral dust does is it ticks all the boxes. So it has your correct rates of your macros, particularly your magnesium and your phosphorus, which you can get in a bolus. And generally, if you look at most buckets, it can't supply enough of those either. So they're really critical. Whereas your bolus is only going to do your trace minerals and generally a very limited proportion. So you might get a bolus that will top up copper and selenium and iodine and zinc, but it's overlooking your vitamins and your manganese then as well. Your lick buckets, are you sure you're getting enough into each animal consistently, or is there a couple of individual cows and there's a hierarchy within cows? So there could be a couple of dominant animals that are overpowering and pushing other stock away from those. They tend to have lots of molasses in it, so individual animals tend to cling to them and have very high intakes and maybe not consistent intakes across the board. So the likes of your pre-calver mineral pack that's ticking all the boxes, it has your magnesium, your phosphorus, it has your correct amounts of your trace elements, it has your vitamin content correct. And once it's ticking all those boxes and you're doing it consistently every day and making sure that as much animals as possible can access it, so doing it 2 or 3 times a day if necessary, if feed space is very tight, or maybe mixing it if that's an option as well. But it's a much more consistent way of getting it into everything and
I think
ensuring that we're doing all 3 jobs.
even when you think about it, your 120 grams a day there for 60 days is just over 7 kilos. Like you obviously just can't get that level of minerals or vitamins in a bolus or a bucket or whatever it may be.
No,
So
like most of your boluses are 100-gram boluses, like, so they're boosting trace elements where they're needed, and there's a role for that maybe during the summer months where animals aren't being supplemented
mm,
and to that effect. But like your pre-calver minerals, generally, if you're buying a well designed one that's meeting all the requirements, you're potentially just overdoing it then if you're going in with a bolus on top. And maybe there might be a better time to be doing that in the year, maybe where supplements reduced or you're not supplementing at all in certain cases.
maybe just to wrap up, 2 or 3 key points for our farmer listeners to do over the next week to 10 days in preparation.
Yeah, so I suppose definitely don't overlook the silage test, and I think it's a really important element. Don't skimp on the length of the dry cow period. in terms of grouping your cows now and taking out cows on time, particularly those early calving animals. They have a very small window to play in general in terms of getting condition on them if they need to, and they've rapid fetal growth, so they are under pressure. So don't skimp on those earlier calving cows. Get them out of the system on time, and good quality mineral. Just consistency is key with it. Make sure it's routinely done every day. If it needs to be done 2 or 3 times a day because of feed space, then do that. It'll be worth it in terms of minimising an animal going down and the workload and stress. With any of these issues in the background, late January, February gets very busy very quick. So if we can minimise any of these issues, it'll set cows up for a much healthier start to lactation and minimise stress on the system. And I suppose another thing, if you can do something in terms of setting yourself up better for the spring in terms of recording issues, because what we often hear this time of year is questions around maybe fertility and different things from last season, and we often can't remember, well, how many cows actually went down, how many retained cleanings did I have, was it actually an issue, or was I just in the trenches and I didn't think about it and just got on with it. So maybe putting a little system in place, maybe try have better record keeping through the spring in terms of following those animals through and looking at the level of health issues on farm and tackling that then more productively going forward.
Thanks very much, Aisling. That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. My thanks to Aisling Claffey for joining me on this week's show. If you have any questions about this week's episode or have suggested topics you would like discussed, you can send them to us at the following email address: dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.